Let me bring in our next guest here, Mohammed Shehada. He is the Chief of Communications of the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor. Joins us now live from Copenhagen. Very good to have you on the program, Mohammed. You've been collecting witness testimonies from people there in Nuseirat who survived. What have they been telling you?
Well, basically, the IDF snuck into central Gaza in civilian vehicles, using the basic population's trust in these trucks that resemble humanitarian aid trucks and also trucks that help displaced families move around. And from there, they started to spray bullets at people on their way everywhere in the street. They entered multiple buildings, some of which the hostages were inside. Some others were just civilians in their own homes. And all of that happened with a very heavy, indiscriminate cover that was provided by the IDF Air Force and Navy and ground troops by bombarding and shelling the area in what is known as fire belts, simultaneous dropping of an insane amount of bombs around the area to create a distraction or a cover for the unit that went inside. So there is the indiscriminate shooting at civilians in the street, shooting of people in their homes, and then bombardment around the area to create the cover. And this is in addition to the escape of these troops through the Biden humanitarian pier that was erected or established in Gaza for the sole purported purpose of bringing humanitarian aid to the starved population. So that entails multiple dimensions of war crimes, possible war crimes that the IDF committed in broad daylight.
Let me just jump in here really quickly, Mr. Shehada, because your organization has actually called for an investigation into that pier to be investigated, whether it was actually used for a military purpose. Do you have any evidence to back that up, that weapons actually were sort of entering Gaza through that pier?
Not on the weapons front. That issue needs to be investigated, although there are estimates, speculations, and observations. But there is the definitive footage that the IDF themselves uploaded, that Israeli media themselves uploaded, of the helicopter evacuating soldiers and hostages from the area of the pier that is supposed to be deconflicted and supposed to be purely humanitarian and protected by U.S. troops. You can even see the two American military vehicles on top of the pier that are supposed to protect it from any sort of hostilities in the area. So they used a purely humanitarian infrastructure for a military operation, which puts in danger humanitarian crews around Gaza and creates and exacerbates a sense of security paranoia for Gazans on the ground. This erosion of trust is part of the overall engineered societal collapse that Israel has been disseminating in Gaza for months.
You're also talking about U.S. troops there. Do you have any evidence about U.S. troops actually taking part on the ground in that hostage rescue operation?
Again, what we have is the Israelis themselves saying that we received intelligence and practical help from the U.S. government, practical and intelligence help in that operation. What that entails can mean a lot of different things. We have testimonies in which people would say that some of the troops had uniforms that do not resemble the IDF. We also heard similar testimonies on the Israeli side on Telegram groups where people say that some of the soldiers and the troops did not particularly wear a uniform that was familiar to an Israeli audience. So these issues need to be investigated further. It does not draw any definitive conclusions, but the very open, flagrant use of the pier for a military operation to evacuate soldiers and hostages in an Israeli military helicopter is egregious on its own. This is using a deconflicted, purely humanitarian area for a very open military operation.
Let's just also look at the fact that there are these reports that they used a civilian truck that looked like it was actually carrying humanitarian aid. Is that an okay way to conduct a military operation among civilians desperate for food?
Absolutely not. It's something that Israel has consistently accused Hamas of and consistently repeated as a war crime. And then they commit it in open, broad daylight and not in one truck. The testimonies we have is that they entered with multiple trucks to the area, one of which was disguised as this sort of a truck that resembles the trucks that bring in humanitarian aid and food to starved people, and another was one that resembled a truck that can be used to transport furniture and help displaced people to move from one area to another. The Israeli reports is that one of these vehicles got stuck on the way. There was also a civilian vehicle that they used, a smaller civilian vehicle. And in these three vehicles that we know of until now, as soon as soldiers came out, they started indiscriminately spraying everyone on their way with bullets. Later on, you had IDF tanks and military vehicles rushing to rescue that one vehicle that got stuck in central Gaza. And again, on their way, they spray people with bullets and bombard them on the way to create cover and distraction to allow for the rest of the Israeli troops to evacuate and flee the area. So this, it creates basically very deep mistrust and distrust and hostility towards actual genuine humanitarian workers when people cannot tell the difference.
Yeah.
And it complicates the work of humanitarian organizations, which in turn exacerbates Israel's engineered use of food as a weapon of war, of starvation as a weapon of war. It makes it even more severe. It makes it nearly impossible for humanitarian workers to conduct their work safely on the ground.
For sure. If you see an aid truck and you don't know if it's actually going to contain food or actually Israeli soldiers. Anyway, I also want to talk to you about news just in over the last few hours. There's news about the Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz. Yesterday he was going to resign. He cancelled that press conference. Now there's news that he's now scheduled a new press conference and is widely expected to resign. What does that tell you about how united the Israeli government is actually at the moment?
Well, it's been particularly concerning. If you look at recent polls, about 94% of Jewish Israelis either thought that the IDF was using sufficient force in Gaza or was not using enough force. They need to even be more aggressive and cruel. Even more recent polls were showing similar results. You have, however, a significant segment of the Israeli population that is calling for prioritizing the return of the hostages and that have not seen the full purported goals of the war being achieved over the course of more than 8 months. So now they say, bring in the hostages first, the battle or the war can wait. But you do not have yet any sort of looking in the mirror to the extent of war crimes and crimes against humanity that were committed in Gaza. Basically, in the Israeli political mainstream, what you have is either people who say, yes, what we are doing in Gaza is right, or people saying, no, we're not using enough force. You do not hear significant dissenting opinions in the government or the war cabinet, or even in the opposition that are saying, hold on, we're going too far in Gaza at the moment. Even someone as the very left-wing hero of the Israeli left, Yair Golan, who's now the head of the left-wing Labour Party, is someone that on the 13th of October openly called for starving the population of Gaza to death. That's a verbatim quote that he used in an interview, starve them to death. That's now the leftist hero in Israel. So it's a very frightening phenomenon. But however, the only hope is this sort of practicality of this segment of the Israeli population that sees no outcome coming out of this war and that is saying we are willing to accept the price of ending the war in return for the full return of our hostages and loved ones in a negotiated deal, which is more likely to bring hostages back alive than these military operations. Even Israeli experts were yesterday saying that these military operations are more or less like a lottery. They are exceedingly rare. And when they take place, they can succeed today and fail tomorrow or the next many days.
Yeah.
There's not a guaranteed way of returning hostages.
We know, of course, only 7 have been released through military operations, but more than 100 have actually been released through negotiations. Mohammed Shehada, really good to have you here on the program and hear your analysis. That's Mohammed Shehada, Chief of Communications of the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor.
Thank you.